The Handkerchief, written by Gr8t 78. Harry Potter and the Wizarding World is the sole masterpiece of J.K. Rowling. Chapter 44. The Tale of the Three Sisters. 3 weeks before term was set to recommence, Draco received what appeared to be a formal invitation by owl post at dawn. It was heavy parchment, and its green wax seal was enchanted to move, a sinister snake body slithering beneath a skull. Draco recognized it from the sky above the forest at the Quidditch World Cup years before. It reminded him painfully of the night he had feared most for Hermione's safety. Turning over the invitation to read the salutation, Draco's blood ran cold. Oh. Draco Lucius Malfoy, head of house, most noble and ancient house of Black, temporary head of house. Most noble and ancient house of Malfoy, the Science Suite in the East Wing, Malfoy Manor, Wiltshire. Oh. He broke the seal, watching as the small circle of wax fell away, then seemed to evaporate into a vapor and hover as a green specter above the parchment. The parchment only contained 8 words. Oh. Riddle House, Little Hangleton, August 13th, 11 o'clock. Oh. Draco felt as though he couldn't breathe. He read the words again as though bidden to memorize them, turned the parchment over to find nothing else, then read them a 3rd time. The things that weren't written down were what scared Draco most. Oh. August 13th was tomorrow. He had so many questions to ask, and there were no answers to be given. He entered the breakfast area to find only Mitty, his mother's elf, and Tiffy, who did most of the cooking. "What can Tiffy get for Master Draco?" she asked kindly with a tremulous smile. "Where is my mother?" he asked a bit too loudly. "Tiffy does not know, sir, and Mitty cannot say, sir. I is being given orders not to speak of it," Mitty said with sorrow in her voice. "What do you mean? Who told you not to speak of it?" Draco's voice grew louder and more harsh. "Mitty's mistress, sir," Mitty nearly whispered, small tears forming in her eyes. "My mother told you not to tell me where she is," Draco nearly yelled. "No, Master Draco, Mitty's new mistress is Mistress Bellatrix. Miss Sissy told Mitty she is having to give Mitty up to Miss Sissy's sister," Mitty cried. At this, she began wailing miserably and fell to the floor, wiping her tears on her pink tea towel dress. Red filled his vision. Ad Narcissa bin Imperiost. "Coerce. Mitty, Tiffy, I am the master of this house, and I demand you reveal to me where my mother has gone." His voice sounded deeper and angrier than even he had ever heard it. The elves cowered frightfully in front of him, Mitty throwing up her arms to cover her head, Tiffy just bowing to the point of nearly lying prostrate on the ground. With a startle, Draco realized he was towering over the pair in a rage, and likely looked and sounded a lot like Lucius in that moment. He took a calming breath. Kneeling down, he placed a steady, gently hand on Mitty's arm. The tiny elf flinched, but raised her head slightly. Her blue eyes were red-rimmed, cheeks puffy, and Draco realized that she'd likely been crying for some time that morning. "Mitty, I'm sorry to yell at you. Can you tell me what happened? When did my mother pass you to Bellatrix?" he asked as kindly as he could. The 2 elves stood, and Draco lowered his stance, dropping back on his haunches to get at eye level with them. "Mitty was summoned last night at midnight, sir. 'Twas strange, because Miss Sissy goes to bed right after dinner since Mistress Bellatrix comes here, sir." Draco could see from her expression that the elf had thoughts about this, but was unable to verbalize them because of her loyalty ties to her new mistress. "Miss Sissy tells Mitty that she may be going away for a time, and that Mitty must follow Mistress Bellatrix's orders now, sir. Then she is transferring the elfin bond to Mistress Bellatrix." "And she didn't tell you where she was going?" Draco asked brokenly. Mistress Bellatrix at this, the elf clapped her hands to her mouth, then dropped to her knees and began banging her head on the floor. Draco quickly picked the elf up and drew her hands away from her mouth, pinning them to her sides. He realized that if the elf continued to try to tell him, she would only fail because of the bond between elf and mistress or master, and would only keep trying to punish herself. "Stop, Mitty, please," Draco asked. Then he lowered his voice again. "Can I ask you a few more things? But I order you not to punish yourself if you can't answer." Mitty nodded gratefully. Apparently this did not go against any order Bellatrix had given her. "Is there anyone else in the house except for me?" Mitty shook her head and said, "No, sir." That was good. At least Voldemort wasn't here. Is the snake here? This he nearly whispered. Mitty shook her head again. No. Did Miss Sissy seem happy when she told you about the bond transfer? Sad, like she felt nothing at all. Draco needed to know if she had been imperiosed. Miss Sissy was crying. She was upset. Mitty wiped at her own eyes again. Mitty has been with Miss Sissy since she was a baby. Mitty and Whimsy and Raffi were the elves for the Black Sisters. We was so proud of we's girls. Whimsy and Raffi was Mitty's sisters, Master Draco. We was 3 sisters for 3 sisters, Mitty said tearfully, huge tears continuing to fall unbidden from her reddened eyes. This brought Draco up short. Where are Whimsy and Raffi, Mitty? What happened to them? Draco asked softly, afraid of the answer. Oh. Once Mitty had managed to compose herself a bit, she began to speak. Raffi was given clothes when Miss Andry left, the wretched elf wailed pitifully. And Whimsy here the elf stopped, clapping her hands to her mouth again, but thankfully not beating herself senseless on the ground. Clearly she had been told at some point not to talk about what happened to Whimsy. When was the last time you saw Whimsy? Don't try to answer if you can't, Draco said gently, hoping to find a way around the elfin bond of silence. The last time Mitty saw Whimsy was behind the stables at the Black Farm in Belgium, sir. Mitty wasn't sure if it was Whimsy because it didn't look like Whimsy anymore, sir. But she had on Whimsy's blue towel, sir, so it must have been Whimsy. There was too much blood everywhere else, though, sir. Igvard found her, sir. Igvard? Who is Igvard? The name stirred a memory for Draco, but with everything else swirling in his mind, he couldn't place it. Igvard was very kind. He kept the creatures at Black Farm, sir. But after he found Whimsy that day, sir, he said he could not stay. He was too sad, sir. Mitty cried anew at the memory of the loss of Igvard, the loss of Whimsy, the memories of that day. Suddenly an image of a tall brown-haired man with wide shoulders and kind eyes came to Draco. He was holding the rope tied loosely around the neck of what Draco thought of as his hippogriff, Starclaw. So Igvard wasn't just an acquaintance of Narcissa's, he had worked for them, had likely known her for many years. And he had found the poor elf, Whimsy, unrecognizable after whatever it was that Bellatrix had done to her. The thought made Draco want to vomit. Mitty, I'm so sorry for what happened to your sisters. Draco closed his eyes as his hand held both hands of the tiny elf. He had known Mitty all his life and had never realized the pain she'd been through. It made him wonder briefly what kind of life Pym had lived, and he hoped he'd get the chance to ask someday. But right now, there were more pressing issues. Mitty, are my mother and Bellatrix, did they go somewhere together? The elf thought for a moment, then decided that this did not break her oath. Yes, Master Draco. He exhaled deeply. Okay, did the Dark Lord go with them? At this, fresh tears appeared in Mitty's eyes. Yes, Master Draco, she said somberly. Mitty, did my mother want to go with Bellatrix? He looked into the elf-pained blue eyes. No, Master Draco. Miss Sissy did not want to leave you alone. He asked Tiffy to take the sorrowful elf to her room to lie down, and ordered them both not to speak about their conversation with him today. He would not be the cause of other elf sisters' demise, because Bellatrix learned that some of her secrets had been shared inadvertently. He sat heavily on the ground, arms wrapped around his knees as the shadows of early morning faded into the soft sunlight of full day. After a long while, he wiped at his eyes and returned to his suite, leaving the table laden with untouched breakfast platters behind. Oh. Back in his room, Draco was faced once again with the sodding summons from Voldemort. He had no idea what Riddle House was. Apparently it was in a village known as Little Hangleton. Draco wondered briefly if he could get away with not going by simply saying he didn't know how to find it. He couldn't yet apparate after all. A pop next to him startled him from his thoughts, and he was relieved to see Pym. They looked at each other for a long moment before Pym spoke. Master did not eat breakfast. I'm sorry, Pym. I wasn't hungry. Did you speak to Tiffy? She told you what Mitty and I talked about. Yes. Pym knew Miss Sissy was gone. Mitty called Pym when they left. Could she say where they went? No, Master. Pym is sorry. Draco drew in a pained breath. It's okay, Pym. I'll find her. Draco rushed to his closet, removing his traveling cloak and heavy dragonhide boots. Pym thinks that Master Draco should stay here. They will be coming back. Draco had been mentally trying to think of things to bring that he likely could not conjure under duress: a knife, his travel potions kit, a water glass, some bandages. The ones who left will return. Their things are all here. They did not leave for a long time. So, I should just wait. Pim nodded. If Master wishes to be taken to where Miss Sissy is, Pim thinks he should wait here. Of course, in his panic over his mother being gone, he'd not put it together she was likely with them at this Riddle house. And they would be coming to bring him there. And they would keep her until whatever this was done. Draco sighed and walked to his bed, lying back and pulling a pillow over his face. Pim, can you tell me about your family? Are you married? Do you have children? Master Draco knows many of Pim's family. Draco removed the pillow. Yes, I met Eustace and Folly too. Mitty is Pim's daughter and Folly's aunt. Draco's breath caught. Pim, I'm sorry. I didn't know that Whimsy your daughter well. I'm so sorry for your loss. Was Whimsy her mother? No, Folly is Raffi's daughter. When Raffi was freed, she went to Hogwarts for a long time. But when Raffi met Nymphadora, she went back to her family. She is with Miss Andry again. Draco was growing more confused. Pim, can you tell me a bit about my family too? Who exactly is Andry and Nymphadora? Oh. After several hours and lunch together with Pim, Draco had a clearer picture not just of Pim's family but his own. Andry was his Aunt Andromeda, the aunt of the books in his closet. She had married a Muggle born, and her daughter Nymphadora was an Aur. Pim had been the personal elf for Alfred Black, the brother of Walburga and Cygnus. When Alfred was removed from the family tree for going against the values of the House of Black, Pim had been moved to the stables and gardens of Cygnus Manor home. He knew Igvard, who worked at the house in Belgium. He had married an elf called Savvy, but his wife had passed away of dragonpox soon after Mitty, their youngest daughter, was born. Pim had been happy when Cygnus and Drula had had 3 daughters. He considered it to be good luck, and was glad that his 3 daughters had a bright future with the black girls as their mistresses. When Whimsy was killed soon after Raffi was freed, it sent Pim into a dark place. Narcissa had been close to finishing at Hogwarts and was betrothed to Lucius. She asked Pim to work in her house when she married so that he might stay close to Mitty. It had been Pim's greatest honor to be assigned to Narcissa's son when Draco was born. But it had hurt Pim that Narcissa's husband had chosen to follow the same beliefs as Bellatrix Black Lestrange. Pim had worried for many years that Draco would follow his father's lead. I am doing all that I can not to follow in my father's footsteps, Pim. But I don't know what is about to happen. They've summoned me to this place. They've said that I need to stand as the head of the house. They've said that I need to complete an impossible task for them. Master Draco is too young to be head of house, objected Pim. Somehow, I don't think that the Dark Lord cares about normal rules and traditions, Pim. Draco leaned back on the sofa in his suite, staring at the ceiling. I think I need to go to the library and look around there. Pim looked sorrowfully at his young charge, the boy he had cared for from infancy. Now 16, as tall and nearly as broad as his father, but with his mother's kind eyes, the boy needed every bit of support he could get. Pim held out his arm to Draco. Pim can take Master Draco to the library, he said evenly. Draco smiled a bit wistfully and held Pim's arm in a way that he had not in several years. Once Draco had grown taller than Pim, it was understood that he no longer needed his elf's help in getting places around the manor. Much like a Muggle parent no longer needs to carry their children after a time. But this small reminder of the connection they shared, it helped calm Draco in an unexpected way. They popped into the Malfoy library and Draco turned to address the room, which was magicked to respond to vocal requests. Text containing the name Tom Riddle. Oh. Chapter 45, Moonlight Sonata. Several hours later, now well into early evening, Draco had an idea of who Tom Riddle had been. He found Riddle's Hogwarts graduation announcement from 1945. Riddle was named head boy and Slytherin prefect and had received a commendation for special services to the school. He seemed well on his way to a role in leadership within the wizarding world. Yet later there was a small article from 1956 about a theft at Borgin and Burke's, thought to be perpetrated by an employee, a shop clerk named Tom Riddle. Draco was surprised that someone with a head boy badge would have ended up as a shop clerk. The photo accompanying the Hogwarts article showed a handsome young dark-haired man that looked nothing like the Voldemort that Draco had met. But the grainier photo from only about 10 years later, the one about the theft at the shop in Nocturne Alley, revealed a more gaunt, haunted-looking Riddle. Draco was able to piece together things a bit. It seemed that Tom Riddle had begun styling himself into Voldemort at some point in the 1950s. He still had his ancestral home apparently, although Draco found it odd that he was the only Riddle mentioned in any Daily Prophet articles. Apparently his parents had never done anything of note in the wizarding world. Riddle all but disappeared around 1997, when he was last spotted in Muggle London. The article simply said that Riddle was being sought for questioning by Muggle law enforcement, who were following up on the murder of a Muggle tramp named Billy Stubbs. Draco searched for articles mentioning the village of Little Hangleton, but the list was incredibly short. There were only 3 brief pieces, all concerning the same man, Morphin Gaunt. The first, from 1927, said that Gaunt had been tried and imprisoned for 3 years in Azkaban for breaking the statute of secrecy, using magic to harm a Muggle and resisting arrest. His father, Marvolo Gaunt, received a shorter sentence for resisting arrest and harming a witch, who apparently lived in the house with Marvolo and Morphin. Then, an article from 1943 that said Morphin had been arrested for killing 3 Muggles in the village. It mentioned that Morphin lived alone in the cottage where he was arrested. There was no mention of the father or the witch. A final article from 2 years later simply stated that Morphin Gaunt of the village of Little Hangleton, serving a life sentence in Azkaban for murder, had died in Azkaban with no known heirs. In short, a dead end. Next, Draco searched for older articles from the First Wizarding War mentioning you-know-who, which were nearly as scarce. He was mentioned briefly as a factor in the ouster from office of Eugenia Jenkins as Minister of Magic. His increasing power in the early 70s led to her dismissal in 1975. Likewise, his name, or rather the lack thereof, appeared in relation to numerous deaths and tragedies throughout the late 1970s and the start of the 1980s. The final mention of any importance came in November 1981. This was the breakdown of the murders of James and Lily Potter and the survival of their young son Harry, all at the hands of Lord Voldemort. The articles concluded that Voldemort had died in the encounter, and speculation continued on and off for years about exactly what had happened in Godric's Hollow that day. Draco had a feeling that Riddle had laid low in the 1960s and early 70s, gathering his followers and building his power, perhaps trying to figure out a way to create eternal life for himself. Considering Draco's discussions with Lucius years ago about the Philosopher's Stone, after a brief plummeting in his stomach, Draco did a text search for books that mentioned methods for prolonging life, or that discussed eternal life. In addition to the use of a Philosopher's Stone, there was vague mention of an obscure spell involving soul magic, and a discussion about drinking unicorn blood. Reading the bit about unicorn blood, his own blood chilled. He took out the handkerchief and spoke the password. "Did Potter ever talk with you about the unicorn, the one that creature had been eating in the Forbidden Forest?" The reply came back quickly. "Yes. He believes it was Lord Voldemort possessing Professor Quirrell." Good God! Draco looked back at the events in his memory, now realizing that for years, Lord Voldemort had been much closer than he had realized. He had been working in Draco's first and second year at Hogwarts, trying to come back. He had had Peter Pettigrew in disguise living within the castle walls for years. In Draco's 4th year, people had likely been helping him within Hogwarts, Igor Karkaroff perhaps, possibly even someone else. Draco was now certain that was how Potter had ended up in the tournament. And somehow Voldemort had succeeded at the end of Draco's 4th year in coming back to life. He felt as though his head had been in the sand this entire time. He asked Hermione the first random question that popped into his head. How did Potter end up in the Triwizard Tournament? My. For the next hour or so, they exchanged messages. Questions were answered, more mysteries were unraveled, and he still had a feeling that not everything had been said. But he had a clear picture. Oh my, he has summoned me to his ancestral home. I'm not sure why, but it is going to happen tomorrow, whatever it is. Actually, it's after midnight now, so it's going to be later today. I don't know what's going to happen, and I'm scared. Oh my God, Draco. Is there any way for you to escape? No. He has my mother. I think he and Bellatrix are keeping her captive there. If I tried to escape, I am sure he would kill her. My mother had set up a way for me to escape earlier this summer, but I knew you would not come with me and I wasn't going to leave you. Her reply took so long. Draco was worried that it was not going to come. Draco, thank you for caring about me enough to want to take me with you. But you're right. There are things on the horizon, big things, forces that we can't even imagine. And Harry is going to have to face them. He's going to need all the help he can get. He replied back. I understand all of that, that's why I didn't ask. But just know that you don't have to save everyone, and also know that I will do everything I can to save you. After a moment, he was startled to realize that his handkerchief was slightly damp. He touched his fingertips to own face in confusion. But his eyes were dry. The situation had become so dire that even tears were not enough right now. Then it occurred to him. These were Hermione's tears. He held the handkerchief to his mouth and kissed it softly. After a moment, he used his to dry his own eyes as well. Oh. Draco had tossed and turned most of the night. As the sky turned from black to gray, he fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of dead unicorns and the shops of Nocturne Alley. He woke at 3 in the afternoon, showered and dressed in a black dress shirt, black pants, and black robes. When he emerged from his closet, lunch had been served in his sitting area, and he picked at the sandwiches, drinking 2 large glasses of elderflower juice. Then he called Pym for a calming draft. Oh. Hermione wrote to say that she loved him and would be thinking of him that evening, and to remind him that no one would blame him for running away or owling Dumbledore for help. This in particular made Draco scoff. If Dumbledore knew the mission with which he was tasked, he would be in Azkaban within minutes. And to leave his mother in captivity with that monster, he could not do it. At 8, Tiffy served dinner. It brought a small smile to his face to see all his favorite dishes: chicken cordon bleu with asparagus, nake with walnuts and gorgonzola, and dragon roll sushi. There were poffertjes, apple streusel, and dark chocolate gelato for dessert. No single course made sense with the next, and the vegetables were scarce. Despite the menu, Draco struggled to eat more than a few bites of anything. At 9, he gave dinner up as a bad job and went to the conservatory. He sat at the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys, then striking the opening notes of he couldn't remember the name of the sonata. But the notes were familiar. Once he had reached 13 and had reached proficiency, his mother allowed his lessons to lapse, but he remembered each note, each rest. Oh. When he finished, Pym touched his elbow lightly. Moonlight Sonata, Miss Sissy's favorite. He hopped up onto the bench and sat down, short legs sticking straight out, small shoes tucked under the keys. He opened the lid of the piano with a snap of his fingers and floating the sheet music out to Draco's outstretched hands. On the back was written in careful handwriting. Oh. Music takes noise and makes it beautiful. It takes discordance and makes it exist in harmony. It takes differences and brings them together. Andromeda Black 1966. Oh. He looked at his watch. Less than 2 hours until. He considered throwing up. He considered throwing himself off the roof. He considered trying to disapparate even though he didn't know how. And finally, he summoned a quill, ink, and parchment. Dipping the quill in ink, he began to write. Oh. Dear Aunt Andromeda. I don't know you, but you sent some books to me when I was a baby, so I guess you know of me. My mother once told me that your crime, the crime that got you banished from our family, was loving a muggle born. It's a crime that I have committed as well. Instead of banishment, I am taking the coward's way out. I do not think I can beat them, so instead I will join them. I will protect her from the inside, or I will die trying. But in case I fail, I must ask a favor of you and your husband. My mother tried to get me to leave and join the mundane world only a few months ago. She had a plan, documents, and money. I believe you and your husband were helping her that day. But I could not leave my witch behind. I am adding your name to my accounts at Gr8t. I do this in the hopes that, if the time comes that muggle-borns are being rounded up and killed, you will do what you can to help her escape. I know she may not accept your help, just as she's already refused mine, but if they come for her, perhaps there will still be time to get her away from here. And please tell Hermione that I love her. Towgers per. Draco Malfoy. Oh. He penned a second letter to Gringotts adding his aunt to his accounts, and called Thorn to the conservatory, sending them off into the night. Oh. It was well after 10 now. His nerves were standing on end. He was beginning to regret the sushi and gelato. It suddenly occurred to him that he didn't know how he was getting to this riddle house. In all the worry of what would happen after he arrived, he'd never considered the journey. At 10:55, he walked into the parlor where the main flue was located. As he stood, looking at the grate, uncertain, there was a pop behind him. Turning, he spotted, well, he was uncertain what it was. It looked like sheer fabric, some sort of vellum perhaps, though closer inspection revealed that it was segmented and looked hard to the touch. With horror, Draco realized it was a bit of snake skin, shed from a very large snake. Nagini. 10:58. He knew what he needed to do, but did not wish to do it. Pym entered the room, and Draco was reminded of all those years before when Pym came to collect him for his first lessons in becoming a gentleman. His eyes prickled with tears just like then, but he forced them back. They locked eyes across the room. Pym nodded once. Draco attempted a smile, failed, then nodded back. He reached out a hand and touched the snake's skin. The hook sensation behind his navel pulled him into darkness, into a feeling of compression, into a separate dimension, into a future unwanted. Oh. Chapter 46. The Dark Mark. Draco's feet landed forcefully on hard ground, and his knees buckled, dropping him to the ground before he found his balance properly. He looked up to find a large manor house gone to seed. Shutters hung off-kilter from windows that had missing panes of glass. Broken and weather-beaten statues framed the open gates. Vines grew upon the facade as though they were the rightful owners of the place. Whatever this place was, it was no manor home like Draco knew. The front door had planks of wood nailed across it in several places with a sign reading, "No trespassing." Draco looked to the left of the house, and there was a dim light shining across the side yard, which was overgrown with tall grass and weeds. He started towards it, suddenly feeling rather exposed standing in the center of the garden this way. Oh. There was a door, barely ajar, next to a dirty window through which a faint light shone. Draco cautiously pushed open the door. A lantern sat on a tabletop nearby. He looked around, surprised to see old Muggle kitchen appliances, light switches on the walls. Electrical bulbs and fixtures overhead. This was a Muggle house. Why had the ancestral home of Lord Voldemort been converted into a Muggle house? A muffled noise sounded across the room, and Draco startled, his lizard brain forgetting everything to focus on the sound. Drawing his wand quickly to point it in that direction. Peter Pettigrew was opening a door straight ahead, and he, too, jumped at the sight of Draco. "Huh? Young Malfoy." "Yes, we'll come. He's expecting you." Peter turned, shuffling back the way he came, evidently expecting Draco to follow. Peter had lit his wand, and Draco did the same. The walls were papered with peeling, yellowed sheets of paper covered with flowers. The floors were bare in places, covered with balding carpet in others. The two wizards crept up the stairs quietly. Draco knew why he was being quiet, but he wasn't sure why Pettigrew was. Apparently the mousy wizard did not feel very comfortable here either. They reached a door on the landing, behind which firelight crackled. Pettigrew pushed open the door, and they crossed the threshold. Oh. Inside, the room was lit by the large fire in a fireplace, as well as 3 floating torches. 7 people, 5 of whom wore long dark robes and silver masks, stood in a semicircle in the center of the room. Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix stood in between these 5, directly in the middle of the row. The 2 of them were unmasked, but both faces were contorted by insanity and manic glee that made their faces appear almost mask-like all the same. Draco's breath caught. Slumped in a tall wingback armchair in the corner of the room, her hands magically bound, sat his mother. She had evidently been crying recently, as tears shone on her cheeks in the torchlight, but now she had been stunned and was silent, eyes closed, breathing laboriously. So here it was, her freedom would be exchanged for his. "Draco." The cold, high voice had never sounded so emotionless. "We are glad you have joined us." The sibilant S seemed to stretch endlessly. "Yes, my lord." Murtlap tentacles. Essence of Dittany. Daisy roots. Crushed valerian root. "As you know, your father, a loyal servant, has been taken." I need another loyal wizard to stand in his place. Can you be that servant in his stead? I must, Lord. Draco bowed his head, not wanting to look at him or Bellatrix, and certainly not his mother, stunned in the corner. Yes. Good, take off your robe. Uncertain of the reason, he removed his robe, standing now in his trousers and shirt. He dropped the robe to the ground. Roll up your left sleeve. Lord Voldemort raised his wand. Syrup of hellebore. Doxy venom. Boomslang skin. Encaustica subpellis masmortar. The incantation seemed to float as a physical body across the room between the two wizards, lying heavy upon the air like smoke above a fire. Suddenly, a shooting pain seared his left arm just below the elbow. It was a fierce burn, accompanied with a feeling of 1,000 quill points, scratching at his skin, sizzling it from the inside out. The pain shot through his entire body, stiffening every fiber with intense, blazing misery. He dropped to his knees, crying out in agony at the sudden torture. His occlumency was no longer needed, as it turned out. His brain was nothing but a white-hot nerve, on fire with the sensation that crept up his arm. There was more speaking now, words being exchanged over him, vows being asked of him, to which the instinctual part of his brain could only say, "Yes, if you can only make this madness stop. Yes, anything for this to be finished. Yes. 1,000 times, yes." As suddenly as the pain began, it subsided enough that his consciousness returned. Draco took a breath, eyes closed. Toad saliva. Crushed moss. Moonstones. Eyes of newt. When he opened his eyes, he discovered that he was lying on the floor, knees curled under him, face down with his left arm cradled beneath him. "Rise, Draco," the high, cold voice commanded. Until Voldemort spoke, the idea of standing seemed impossible to Draco. But he knew that he must, so he pushed himself into a kneeling position, still cradling his arm as discreetly as possible. There remained a deep ache within his arm that seemed to seep from the skin into the sinew and bone. It felt as though the ache might never completely go away. He pushed himself up onto his haunches, grabbing his robe as he did so, and stood. "Very good, Draco," his loathsome Aunt Bellatrix said. "When your father took the mark, he cried, 'The wretch!'" Her mirthless laugh echoed off the walls of the room. Draco's jaw clenched. He too felt near tears, but could not let them fall. "You will always carry this mark to remind you of your rightful lord, young Draco. I see much potential in you. I am certain you will have an illustrious career in my employ." "Yes, my lord." Draco was surprised his voice sounded as steady as it did. That was to say, it did not sound steady, but did not sound as tremulous as he feared it might. "When you feel the mark burn, you must apparate to me. If you extend your arm and touch the skull with 2 fingers, I will apparate to you." "Yes, my lord." Draco did not yet know how to apparate, but now was the time to bring this up. After all, in 3 weeks he would be going back to school, and it was impossible to apparate in and out of Hogwarts. And he could think of no reasons why he'd want Voldemort to come to him. "I am not an uncaring man, Draco. I know the task I have set for you, while simple, may not be easy. Therefore, you may have the assistance of some of my servants. However, you must find a way to allow them into the school so that they may help you." "Yes, my lord." So Voldemort knew about the lack of ability to apparate into Hogwarts. That was good. His arm was starting to burn again. "Come, Draco." Bellatrix cackled. "Let us take Sissy home and have a drink to celebrate. Gr8t." At this last word, she pointed her wand at Narcissa, whose eyes flew open in confusion. "My dragon." Narcissa's tear-filled voice broke across him with a sorrow he had seldom heard in it. "No, Madame Malfoy, I must beg to differ. He is my dragon now." The high cold laugh of Voldemort filled the room, joined by the titters and bellows of the other Death Eaters in the room. Oh. Back at the manor, Draco struggled to remain upright. The burning in his arm consumed the majority of his conscious thought. The nausea from the side-along apparition with Bellatrix had claimed the last of the sushi and gelato from earlier. Thankfully, Tiffy met them in the parlor and vanished his sick instantly. Bellatrix was not a smooth apparitionist. The usual feeling of compression and space had been accompanied by a twisting, ringing feeling of his insides. A drink. Bellatrix had cried, and Tiffy popped away for mulled wine. Where's that useless elf of mine? Miggy, Middy, said Narcissa weakly, as though just the two syllables had taken all her strength to muster. Middy popped into existence in front of them and curtsied. There you are, you slovenly piece of filth. Bring me some buttered scones, a copy of Witch Weekly, and a calming draught for my sister. Middy curtsied once more and popped away. I just get it for the recipes, she leered T. Draco. Did you want anything? I can call her back. No, thank you, he coughed out. I think I will go to bed. He made as if to leave, but found his path blocked when Bellatrix slammed the parlor doors closed with her wand. No, Drakey Poo, we're sharing a drink, remember? Bellatrix's sing-song voice rang out. Middy brought the calming draught magazine and scones. Tiffy brought the wine. Bellatrix tore into a scone with her graying teeth and swigged the wine, smacking her lips. A bit of pink-colored scone crumb dribbled from her mouth. Draco was again reminded of Walburga Black and suppressed a shudder. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Bellatrix piped up again. But Draco, we've entirely forgotten to show Mummy your new decoration. He stilled, holding a mouthful of wine in his clamped jaw, trying to convince himself to swallow it. Without a word, Bellatrix pointed her wand at his arm and yelled defiando. He jerked back instinctively from the cutting curse, but she'd only cut off his sleeve, exposing the dark mark to the room. Draco briefly wondered why Lord Voldemort had not just done that instead of making Draco roll up his own sleeve. Perhaps it was a way to make the mark taker feel that they chose the mark. Or maybe Voldemort's magic just wasn't strong enough, he mused. Narcissa, whose tears had only just subsided, began crying anew. Oh. Draco slept under nearly nightfall the next day, almost 16 hours straight, so he awoke to numerous messages on his handkerchief. He was thankful that he'd left it on his nightstand. If it had fallen out of his robe when he tossed the garment on the floor at Riddle House, he didn't know what he'd do. Her messages to him started out calm, but grew steadily more frantic. She'd said the time every time she had written. She had clearly been watching the clock. It's midnight now. I hope you're all right. 3 in the morning. Did you get home yet? 5:30 a.m. I'm going to sleep. Please message me when you see these. It's 6:30 now. Turns out I was lying about sleeping. Are you okay? What happened? Draco. It's just after 10 o'clock in the morning. I slept a little, but I'm worried. You're not reading the messages. It's almost 2:00 in the afternoon. Where are you? Draco. Please answer. As he held the handkerchief in his hands, it warmed once again. Draco. My handkerchief turned cool. You got my messages. I'm sorry to send so many. I was just so worried. He cleared his throat and choked out a reply. I'm here, back at the manor. I'm all right. But he wasn't all right. There was a heavy throb in his left arm. It felt as though it weighed 100 pounds. It hurt to move his entire body. What did he make you do? Draco did not know what to say. A part of him knew that keeping secrets from her would be the beginning of bad faith, and he did not want for them to have secrets of this magnitude. On the other hand, he felt defiled, dirty, sullied, and if he felt that way about himself, how could she feel any differently about him? How could she allow herself to be defiled and sullied by an association with him? She should want nothing to do with him, and he would not blame her if she never spoke to him again. But secrets could destroy so much, and he would not let it destroy them. They would do whatever it took to overcome it. He opened his mouth, intending to tell her what now Gr8t his arm, but his tongue locked into place, pressed against the roof of his mouth. His brows knitted together in confusion. He took a breath, and then tried to start again, intending to speak a different phrase with the same information, but his tongue was locked. He realized with dawning horror that Voldemort, in addition to marking him as a servant of the darkness, had also placed a secrecy bond upon him. He would not be able to write or speak about anything that had happened in Little Hangleton last night, and he couldn't even say that he couldn't speak of it. He tried a different tact, saying, "There is nothing to talk about. Please don't let it worry you." A reply came back immediately. "What do you mean? Of course there's something to talk about. Of course I'm worried. Please, Hermione, there was nothing. Let's talk about something else. When can I see you again?" There was a long moment's pause before she replied again. "We will see each other at Hogwarts in just a few weeks." That was too long to wait. That's too long to wait. Are you going into Diagon Alley for supplies before school this year? Yes, I believe we're going in about a week. Message me when you know the date. I'll be there. Draco, we're not going to be able to meet up. I'm going to have Harry and the entire Weasley clan with me. Not to mention, a third of Hogwarts will be there. I know. I just want to see you. Just putting his eyes upon her, assuring himself that she was still alive, would be enough. Okay. I love you. I love you so much, Hermione. Oh. Chapter 47, in Diagon Alley. Over the next week, time dragged as he waited for his chance to see his witch. Draco thought more about his experience at the Riddle House now that he had time to look back on it with more clarity. He had decided that his earlier assessment about the strength of Voldemort's magic was right. As much as the wizard was feared, he did not seem as strong as he apparently had been at one time. But it seemed that his strength was rebuilding. The wizard he'd first met some weeks ago likely wouldn't have been able to cast the Dark Mark branding spell as easily as he had on August 11th. And what was the bit about getting help from some of the Death Eaters? There was no way that Dumbledore or the Aurors or other professors would allow Death Eaters into the castle by flue, gate, or broom. It was impossible to apparate in, out, or within the grounds. What other possible way did he have to get anyone inside? He was lying back on his bed pondering this very question for the 16th time that day, staring lazily at the open wardrobe across from the foot of the bed. Inside hung his Quidditch kit, and stuck up on the door with permanent sticking charms were a handful of team photos from over the years. There was the team photo of his second squad from his third year. Flint, a hardened look in his eye, likely pissed off because they had only just missed winning the Quidditch Cup. Derek and Bowl, looking a bit confounded about why they were there. Warrington, his handsome features twisted in a smirk. Bletchley, who seemed surprised to have made the squad. And Montague, large smile oblivious to what was going to happen to him in a couple of years. Last he'd heard, Montague was being taken care of by around-the-clock medi-witches at his home. All because he couldn't stop nattering on about the two identical imps that shut him into a cabinet that he couldn't escape. Spending vast amounts of time floating between two planes of existence, one a shop of some sort and the other a collection of forgotten junk. The way Montague described the cabinet, it almost sounded like this wardrobe in front of him. Draco shuddered to imagine being stuck inside such a place for months on end. And yet, Montague's imagination had made him fabricate a shop full of dark artifacts. This above all things seemed odd. It was one thing to imagine skittering creatures, haunting bits of music, broken magical toys. It was entirely another to fantasize about transactions in a shop. Draco sat up suddenly. He had been in a shop like the one Montague had described, a shop that sold things like cursed necklaces, poisonous candles, biting tea kettles. A shop where men might discuss dark artifacts. It seemed as though he had more than one objective in going to Diagon Alley next week. He would need to stop by Borgin and Burke as well. But what of the other things, the skittering creatures and broken toys? The ghost's words came back to him. Ah, yes, I recall that cabinet. I believe Mr. Filch put it in the room of hidden things. What was the room of hidden things at Hogwarts? He thought a moment before realization dawned. He whispered a name into the air. Dobby. The elf popped in, standing on his bed, and looked at Draco with a helpful smile. Dobby, you know the room of requirement, right? How it can become other things, other places, depending upon the needs of the user. Yes, Draco Malfoy. Oh. Diagon Alley was eerily quiet when he and his mother stepped out of the back door of Leaky Cauldron, into which they had flewed. This solemnity was unexpected. Draco had hoped to have the cover of crowds from which to watch his witch. Now he and his mother would be out in the open. What do you need first, my dragon? New robes, perhaps, or your favorite strawberry ice cream? Narcissa smiled fondly at him. She hefted the ugly handbag containing Peter Pettigrew onto her other arm. For a rat, he was quite heavy. When she had announced at breakfast that she and Draco were going to Diagon Alley for school shopping, Pettigrew had insisted upon coming along in his animagus form. Draco had tried to go back to his room to send a message of warning to Hermione that Peter would be with him. He gave Pettigrew the excuse of supposedly getting a lighter cloak, but Pettigrew told him to simply summon it. Draco assumed that the balding wizard had orders not to let him out of his sight if they left the house. Draco smiled back at his mother, knowing that truly, the ice cream parlor was Narcissa's favorite stop in this wizarding neighborhood. If they were out together, they may as well enjoy themselves a bit. Pettigrew's presence be damned. They turned up the street, heading towards the bright yellow umbrellas that covered the cafe tables outside of Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. As they neared the spot, however, it became clear that something was wrong. About half of the umbrellas were missing, and a third of the tables lay on their sides on the curb. The door to the ice cream parlor, normally thrown wide to welcome and foot traffic, was boarded up. The windows papered over with ministry warnings and notices of escaped prisoners. Where is Florian? Narcissa sounded as though she were near tears. I don't know, Draco said lamely. He chanced to look at his mother. Her look of agony far exceeded that of someone who wanted a cup of melon sorbet. She looked at him, grimacing, and shook her head slightly. No. Don't ask me about it. Well, said Narcissa with forced brightness in her voice, let us go and check on those robes, Madame Malkins. They strode arm in arm up the street, pausing occasionally to look in a shop window. Eolipsal Emporium had a small trickle of customers, and the apothecary was quite busy. Draco tried not to draw attention to the fact that Narcissa was sniffling a bit, commenting on the items in the windows as they passed. They passed the entrance to Nocturne Alley without a mention of it. He knew that he needed to find a way to Borgin and Burke's before they left. But the idea of going there really, of what he needed to do there made his stomach knot. Oh. Madame Malkins was empty of customers when they opened the door, the bell tinkling overhead to alert the owner of entering customers. Mrs. Malfoy, how may I help you today? The shop proprietor was a bit more clipped and formal with her words than she typically was with Narcissa. Lucius's imprisonment had set them back socially, to be sure. My son Draco is starting his 6th year at Hogwarts. As the Quidditch captain and a prefect, new robes are a must. Of course. Right this way, the gray-haired witch pointed, leading them to a display of ornate wizard's robes. Narcissa followed, Pettigrew's bag on her arm. Slight movement on the street outside caused Draco to turn and peer out of the windows. Hermione, surrounded by a large herd of Weasleys, Hagrid, and the truly ridiculous hair of Potter, stood on the street about 7 doors down. He looks back at his mother and the shop owner, who were talking animatedly over the various dress robes on display. Taking a chance, Draco removed his handkerchief from his robe pocket and said, Vinca Major. We are in Diagon Alley, at Madame Malkin's, but we have Pettigrew with us. He can hear everything we're saying. When we meet, I'm going to try to pick a fight with Potter and the Weasleys. My mother will likely defend me if they fight back. Maybe everyone else will get distracted, and we can have a moment alone. He hoped that she understood. If they encountered each other, both of them would need to play their parts to make the moment convincing. As he watched through the window, Hermione took out the handkerchief from her cuff. unfolding it and pretending to wipe the late summer heat from her brow as her lips moved minutely. Then she opened the handkerchief, and in his pocket, he felt his own handkerchief cool. She replaced the handkerchief, turning distractedly back to the others. The group split in half, with the Weasley parents and the youngest wee slut going in one direction, while Hermione, Hagrid, and the two doofuses marched toward their direction. Draco, come and look at this one, see if you like it. Draco took off the robe he'd worn into the shop and slipped on the new one, and inspiration struck. Perhaps his mother could stay and pick out the robes with Pettigrew. And he could make the excuse of getting done faster by going alone to select the special arithmancy parchment at Dervish and Banches. He could run into the fearless foursome outside, and perhaps Hermione would remember that she needed the same parchment. He wasn't sure if the Potter and Weasley would let her go alone, but he would love to see them try and stop her. Mother, why don't you stay and select some new robes, and I'll just go ahead to the next shop so that we can get done faster. Narcissa's eyes widened. No, my dragon, I don't think that's the best idea. Draco knew that she likely did not want to be left alone in public with Peter, and he felt a bit guilty for even asking. But he really wanted the chance to speak to Hermione. The shop doorbell tinkled behind them. I'm not a child, in case you haven't noticed, Mother. I am perfectly capable of doing my shopping alone. Now, dear, your mother's quite right. None of us is supposed to go wandering around on our own anymore. It's nothing to do with being a child. Madame Malkin was bustling about him now, pinning up the cuffs of the robe. She bloused out the left sleeve, turning it under a bit far to locate the crease she had already started, jabbing her pins into the excess fabric above the fold. Watch where you're sticking that pin, will you? He hissed as the tip of one of the pins grazed against the tender, reddened flesh on his arm. Blinking back a small tear of pain, he walked to the mirror to look at the robe, but really was hoping to see out of the windows in case Hermione had gone into a nearby shop. The three of them were standing only 15 feet away, nearly directly behind him. Oh. Hermione wore a blue muggle sundress with little white squares dotting the fabric. Her hair was braided to one side, and on the other side of her head was nestled a sapphire and pearl barrette. She smiled slightly at him, eyes sparkling just a bit. In contrast, the Wonder Boys had their wands drawn, eyes narrowed at him menacingly. If you're wondering what the smell is, Mother, a mudblood just walked in, said Draco loudly. He knew his mother would want to know that Potter had entered, and he wanted her to know that Hermione was with Potter. It was unfortunate that letting her know also let Pettigrew know. I don't think there's any need for language like that, said Madame Malkin, hurrying up beside him, looking at the two wizards who had just entered. And I don't want wands drawn in my shop either. No, don't. Honestly, it's not worth it, Hermione said quietly, and Draco knew that she meant his plan of creating an argument between his mother and Potter. He turned to the other wizard. Yeah, like you dare do magic out of school, he jeered at Potter. Now that they were closer, he took a better look at Hermione, and was incensed to see that she had bruises on her face, carefully covered with muggle makeup. What the fuck had happened at the Weasley house? Was this family of wizard buffoons so ornery that they resorted to fistfights to entertain themselves? Or had she met with something more sinister? Who blacked your eye, Granger? I want to send them my fist to their face flowers. He locked eyes with her, widening them slightly in question, and tilted his head. She smiled a bit and shook her head, as if to indicate that it was nothing. Still, the instinct to protect his witch from harm had riled Draco up. That's quite enough, interrupted Madame Malkin. She turned to Narcissa. Madam, please. His mother stood, hoisting the ugly bag in front of her. Put those away. If you attack my son again, I shall ensure that it is the last thing you ever do. Narcissa looked at the two wizards with wands drawn appraisingly. Apparently he wasn't the only Malfoy with a protective streak. Potter was clearly spoiling for a fight. Really? Going to get a few Death Eater pals to do us in, are you? From next to him, Madame Malkin made a noise like a rat being eaten by a Kneazle. Really, you shouldn't accuse, that's a dangerous thing to say. Wands away, please. The elderly witch gestured to their wands with an air of authority, as though she herself had not insulted Narcissa only a few minutes before. Narcissa smiled tightly. I see that being Dumbledore's favorite has given you a false sense of security, Harry Potter. But Dumbledore won't always be there to protect you. Potter looked around comically. Wow, look at it's not here now. So why not have a go? They might be able to find you a double cell in Azkaban with your loser of a husband. Draco was outraged, even as a very small part of him was slightly impressed at the bollocks of this idiot. He stepped towards Potter off of the platform in front of the mirror, catching the long hem of the robes he was wearing and stumbling a bit. The weasel sputtered in laughter. Don't you dare talk to my mother like that, Potter. He spat. It's all right, Draco, said Narcissa, placing a calm hand on his shoulder. I expect Potter will be reunited with dear Sirius before I am reunited with Lucius. It was a low blow, even Draco could see that. So much for Potter and his mother being a satisfactory distraction. From the looks of it, Potter was going to be back in another hearing for underage magic soon. Harry, no, said Hermione, pulling the daft wizard's arm down. Think you mustn't. You'll be in such trouble. Madame Malkin apparently felt as Draco did that Hermione's word on the subject was final. I think this left sleeve could come up a little bit more, dear. Let me just... Ouch! Bellowed Malfoy, slapping at her as she jabbed yet another pin into his dark mark. Watch where you're putting your pins, woman. He turned to his mother and widened his eyes, looking sidelong at his left arm to indicate the problem. Mother, I don't think I want these anymore. He pulled the robes over his head and they fell to the floor at Madame Malkin's feet. You're right, Draco, said Narcissa, who stared down her nose at Weasley. Now I know the kind of scum that shops here will do better at Twilfit and Tattings. They exited quickly, Draco being sure to shoulder-check Weasley on the way out. The stupid tosser couldn't even be bothered to come to his two friends' defense. He just stood there like a wart on a toad and let his friends be insulted. What an absolute wanker. Oh. He and Narcissa made their way up the street, stopping in the apothecary for potion ingredients, and the Owl Emporium for treats for Thorn and Colwyn. He noticed with some horror that Ollivanders was closed, warded up as well. That did not bode well. Where would people get wands? He did not bring the shop closure to his mother's attention. She did not need that right now. Up ahead, he saw her favorite tea shop and turned towards it. They were soon seated in Lady Everly's tea cozy for tea and sandwiches. Narcissa had found a few friends, Caris Flint, Margaret Macmillan, and Lachlan Bletchley to distract her. Draco, now desperate for at least one of his plans to work, whether it was seeing Hermione or going to Borgin and Burke's and investigating this thing, stood. Mother, I believe I left my wand on that table at Madame Malkin's. It was behind those flowers, so I didn't notice it when we left. I will be right back. Oh. Before his mother could object or stop him, he swept from the little cafe, out of the front door and back down the street. Looking in the windows of the robe shop, he could see that she and her friends had moved on. He looked into the windows of the Owl Emporium and Apothecary, Flourish and Blots, and Dervish and Banges with no luck. One of the last shops on the street, in contrast to all the others, appeared to be doing a roaring trade in merchandise. Whereas the rest of the shop windows were drab and dark, some papered over, these windows sparkled with magic. The purple and orange lights from within enticing customers. Draco stopped and stared. This was the infamous Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, the joke shop of Fred and George Weasley. Outside the shop, marionette-looking statues of the two young wizards, identical to the very last, rose high above the entrance. The two marionettes took turns doffing hats to passers-by, impish grins upon their faces. Two identical imps. With a jolt of realization, Draco suddenly knew which task was more important today. As much as he wanted to see Hermione, if she was in that shop, she was surrounded by Weasleys. There would be no moment of privacy for the two of them, no matter what. He turned, looking furtively up and down the street around him, making sure that his mother had not freed herself from the confines of Lady Everly's and her friends. Then he set off at a brisk pace to Nocturne Alley. Chapter 48. The Shopkeeper's Stories. Borgin and Burke's was just as dark and empty as the rest of the shops in Nocturne Alley and half of those in Diagon Alley. The only difference was the little shop was still open for business. He entered, finding the greasy slicked back hair of Borgin himself bent over a ledger at the counter. The room was overshadowed by a large black cabinet in the center of the space. This must be similar to the cabinet that Montague found himself inches, but how had he possibly been here? Mr. Malfoy. Borgin looked up, fixing him with a look as though Draco were something particularly disgusting stuck to the bottom of his boot. What a very great pleasure. I know it must be, Draco drawled. Listen, I've got some questions about this cabinet. What is it? This is a vanishing cabinet. Borgin said it as though it were incredibly obvious. At Draco's look of confusion, he continued. Allow me to explain. Say that you have enemies. You need to make a quick getaway, but you don't know how to apparate. Or perhaps there are wards in place that prevent apparition. You want it to be untraceable, so you don't want to use a flue which is regulated by the ministry. Or perhaps you simply don't have a flue connected, but you have this. You can just step into the cabinet and go. Draco asked, Go where? Well, it would depend. Some early or primitive versions would just be luck of the draw. They might be connected to any random bit of furniture anywhere, so long as the magical signatures of the wood used to make the two furniture pieces were compatible. You might end up in the altar of a convent in Palma de Mallorca or inside of an outhouse on the Texas plain. But for the discriminating witch or wizard, it was preferential to have one cabinet in one place, and another matching cabinet in a second secure location. That way, when the hordes were at your door, you could make an escape and guarantee that you ended up where you intended, and not facing a glory hole in a stall of a pub toilet in Prague. What is a glory hole? Is that similar to my hand of glory? Draco furrowed his brow, recalling the unique artifact that his father had purchased for him several years before. Borgin eyed him beadily. It is not. Draco waited a moment, but Borgin seemed unwilling to elaborate on what a glory hole actually was. Never mind, then let's just get back to it. So this cabinet, I assume it is one of the latter types, the ones that are part of a set? Draco asked. These two cabinets were owned by a former headmaster of Hogwarts many years ago. Perhaps you've read his name in the annals of your own family's genealogical records. Your great-great-great-grandfather Phineas Nigellus Black. Borgin sneered at him. He was an unpopular professor, and as the headmaster during the Goblin Rebellion in the 1890s, he felt it prudent to have a means of escape from Hogwarts. When he passed away sometime in the 1920s, several of his heirlooms were lost to his son's debauchery. Gambling, illicit potions, philandering, and such. This cabinet came into our possession several years ago. But the matching cabinet, the one presumably still at Hogwarts, something was wrong with it. It was no longer placed out in the open for anyone with the know-how to use. It had been put away somewhere else after Peeves dropped it, according to the Gryffindor ghost. The room of broken toys, strange creatures, malfunctioning Victrolas. It must be broken as well. That's why Montague couldn't get out. The tunnel was opened, but incompletely so. At times, Montague had been here in this dark and foreboding shop, unable to open the door and step out. At other times, he had been where? In the passage between. In the room of hidden things. Where had he been when the room was changed to something different? Draco inwardly shuddered to think of the unusual possibilities of dimension, time, and space. And how do the two cabinets work? Do they form some kind of a tunnel? To be honest, I am uncertain, sir. Borgin said the last word with more than a little disdain. I believe it is much like a flue, and that the travel is somewhat quick, although perhaps not instantaneous. But instead of flue powder to initiate the movement, an incantation is used. I see. I believe that the twin of this cabinet is damaged. Do you know how to fix it? Possibly. I'll need to see it, though. Why don't you bring it into the shop? Borgin asked smoothly. I can't. It's got to stay put. I just need you to tell me how to do it. Draco was certain that if he somehow managed to get the other cabinet out of Hogwarts Castle, there was no way it was going back inches. Well, without seeing it, I must say it will be a very difficult job, perhaps impossible. I couldn't guarantee anything. Borgin gave him a look as if to say, I don't wish to help you and there's nothing you can do about it. Draco said, growing angry. Now appeared to be the time to play his trump card. Perhaps this will make you more confident. He drew up his sleeve, brandishing the reddened and angry-looking dark mark that was embedded in his skin. Tell anyone and there will be retribution. You know Fenrir Greyback. He's an old family friend. He'll be dropping in from time to make sure you're giving the problem your full attention. Draco said quietly. He recalled the disgusting man who visited the manor early in the summer. The name appeared in the Daily Prophet often, and he seemed to be quite feared. If the dark mark in Greyback's name didn't convince Borgin, nothing would. There will be no need for. I'll decide that, he said sharply. Well, I'd better be off. And don't forget to keep that one safe, I'll need it. Perhaps you'd like to take it now? Borgin asked quickly, clearly wanting to be well shot of this whole situation. No, of course I wouldn't. You stupid little man, how would I look carrying that down the street? Just don't sell it. Draco shook his head in disbelief. Of course not, sir. The older man gave a small bow. Borgin's tone was less cordial now, but was more respectful, deferential. Draco felt slightly repulsed with himself to realize that that respect had come from fear. Who was he, to be feared? He was just some stupid, scared 16-year-old. Not a word to anyone, Borgin, and that includes my mother, understand? Draco said. Especially his mother. If she knew what he was doing right now, intimidating a shopkeeper, planning an invasion at his school, contemplating murder, she would never look at him the same way. Because now, Draco saw a possibility. This was the way into Hogwarts. This was the way to bring back up people that could complete this impossible and ridiculous mission that he had been set upon. Surely it mattered not who completed the mission, so long as it was done. Draco did not want to kill Dumbledore, but his memories held a lot of secrets. His mother, placing Peter's bag knowingly with his items on platform 9 3/4, contacting her banished sister, or telling him to contact the Order about Creatures' betrayal and Bellatrix's possible escape. Blaise telling him that he and Theo did not subscribe to this pure blood nonsense. Visiting a witch that has fought against Death Eaters in the Department of Mysteries. Professor Snape giving him Murtlap tentacles, teaching him occlumency, rushing into the forest after Hermione and Potter. Dobby taking warning messages to Potter and the others about Umbridge's approach, telling him he wasn't a bad wizard. Hermione telling him that she loved him. He did not want to kill Dumbledore, but if given the choice between the old wizard and his own mother, Hermione, his friends, Snape, possibly even Potter, he felt sure that even Dumbledore would understand. Draco only hoped that one day soon, he would understand as well. Oh. That night, back at the manor, Narcissa joined him again in his room, turning up the quiet music that played over the wireless and casting wards and a muffling charm for good measure. She had covered for him when he returned to Lady Everlise, praising him for purchasing the rest of his supplies while he was gone, even though he had done no such thing. He was certain that she planned to discreetly purchase them the following day by owl. But tonight she was angry and fearful, wanting to know where he had been. Mother, I told you, there were some things I needed to take care of. Draco, if you were meeting with her. I wasn't. I was just going to say, if you are meeting with her, I understand it, but it's dangerous. Narcissa sighed, sitting down on the divan and twisting the fabric of her robes nervously. Perhaps you noticed that the ice cream parlor is closed? She looked up at him sharply, her face trying hard to mask her emotions. What you did not know is that I was very good friends with Florian in our youth, perhaps more than friends. His mother reddened slightly. But I was a member of the Sacred 28, and there could be no half-blood husband for me. Sickness would have killed me first. The only way Andromeda escaped was with her wand and the clothes on her back. And even then, I know she was constantly afraid for a long time that he would find her and kill her anyway. Draco was quiet. Suddenly, all the lengthy visits to the ice cream parlor over the years made complete sense. It was always his mother's first stop in Diagonelli, and yet always seemed to put his father on edge. Draco had always assumed that Lucius disliked the frivolity of it all, the abundance of choices. The brightly colored glass dishes and elaborate concoctions, the sweetness and messiness and indulgence of it all. But it was likely merely jealousy. Draco idly wondered for a moment what life would have been like as the son of the ice cream shop owner. Fortescue had always seemed kindly, jovial, an interesting fellow who invented flavors the way other wizards might invent potions or spells. Draco smiled inwardly. One thing was for certain, if he'd been raised by Florian Fortescue, he'd have probably looked a lot more like Vince and Greg. He went to sit by his mother on the divan, holding her hands as she fought not to cry. Narcissa met his eyes gratefully with a tremulous look of appreciation. He took a handkerchief, a different one from the one with which he communicated with Hermione, from his trouser pocket and offered it to her. She smiled ruefully at him. "Don't want me using the other one." "What other one?" he asked, surprised and a bit defensive. "Oh, Draco, sweet darling. You're not the first couple of Hogwarts students to come up with a means of private conversation. When I was at Hogwarts, several girls had mirrors to speak through or a charmed notebook." At Draco's dumbfounded look, Narcissa gave him a watery chuckle. "No need to look so scandalized, my dragon. Your old mother was young too, once." "Mum, you're still young." He took her hand carefully. "You know you don't have to stay here. You can go, escape now. I'll be all right, but I need for you to be safe too. You shouldn't have to be punished for a decision your father made for you when you were 14. She sighed. "I can't, darling dragon. I took a vow, a marital vow years ago to stand by your father. Now isn't the time to break it." Draco hoped that she was leaving, unsaid that, while now might not be the time, she was leaving the option in the future. He put his arm around her shoulders as she wiped her fresh tears. "I'm sorry about today. I know that must have been difficult." His mother and his aunt had lived in fear for decades, simply for loving someone different from them. What a horrible, fucked up world they had chosen to live in. "Oh." Later that night, his handkerchief warmed. "We saw you in Borgin and Berks today. What are you trying to fix there?" He was trying to fix this fucked up decision he made, he thought. Instead, he wrote, "It's a very long story. I don't think I can tell it yet." She replied, "So, are we starting the year with secrets between us?" He wanted to reply that he couldn't even talk to her about the things that he couldn't talk to her about. But the secrecy bonds prevented the words from even forming silently on his lips. But there was one thing that he could say for sure to her. "Everything I do, every decision I make, I'm trying to make with you and your safety in mind. Not all of them are going to be good. I'm sorry in advance." She did not reply, but Draco had to hope that she could understand at least a bit. If there was any way to prevent it, he would not wake up one day to learn that the person he'd loved had vanished. Oh. Chapter 49. Chosen and Unchosen. The Hogwarts Express was a bit more than halfway through its journey north into Scotland. To Draco, it felt like a ride to purgatory. Knowing that at the end of the track was a task so horrible, so vile, he had a hard time feeling excited about the new school year. He was supposed to have gone to the prefect carriage. But he could not bring himself to face Hermione just yet, knowing what he was now contemplating more seriously after the visit to Nocturne Alley. Instead, he chose a carriage with Theo and Blaise. Vince and Greg joined then at the last minute, and Pansy showed up after the prefects' meeting. Pansy had pronounced that he looked tired, and insisted that he lay down and rest. When he dozed off, she'd come and sat next to his head on the seat. She had begun stroking his hair while he slept. When he finally woke up, Draco lay there a bit uncomfortably for several minutes. He didn't tell her to stop, an odd holdover moment from the paralyzing discomfort of his experience with Pansy years before. He finally decided to take the small kindness as a gesture of friendship, even if part of him worried that she meant it as more than that. As luck would have it, the Weasel, closely followed by Hermione, had passed by the compartment. Both glanced in to see him sitting with the group. The Weasel had given him an ugly look, though to be honest, it might have just been his face. Draco answered heartily with a two-bird salute. Hermione's copper eyes had widened at the sight of him with his head nearly in Ponzi's lap. But she and the weasel sped up and were gone before he could sit up, much less give her a "no, it's not what it looks like" look. Draco dozed fitfully in his seat. He hadn't had a good night's sleep in going on 3 weeks. After a time, a second-year Ravenclaw arrived with a note for Blaise, who read it with a perplexed expression on his face. The young Ravenclaw girl stood around, waiting for his reply. "What's that about?" Draco asked. "Apparently, there's a new professor on board, and he wants to meet me. I guess he wants to rub elbows with the best of the best." "And he chose you." Theo chuckled. "You forget, Aradia has been on magazine covers, even Muggle television adverts, for many years," Blaise answered boldly. "Ah yes, Aradia, Blaise's mother, the woman who inspired far too many teenage shower wanks among Blaise's friends." Blaise looked up sharply when this thought popped into Draco's mind and shot him a look that clearly said, "Eat shit." Draco apologized with a tilt of his head and a lift of one corner of his mouth. "Who else got these?" Draco asked the little Ravenclaw girl to move his mind off of Blaise's mother. "Belby, McLagan, Longbottom, Potter, and Ginny Weasley." "Belby? What a tosser. And Cormac McLagan is a waste of good hair. Why the wee slut, I wonder?" Draco mused. "Slughorn said he saw her do a nice piece of magic in the corridor, a bat bogey hex." "Oh yes, well that is a good one," Draco conceded, sniffing slightly and brushing his nose. "I'm surprised he didn't invite Granger, we've all seen her talents." Blaise gave him a sidelong slow smile as if to say, "Take that, you fucking asshole, for thinking about my mother that way." Draco lazily shot a stream of water at Blaise's crotch, which caused them both to laugh uncontrollably for a moment while Blaise did a drying charm. "Slughorn, I think he taught my father. Lucius always spoke highly of him. I wonder why he didn't invite me. Maybe he didn't know I was here." "I don't think so. There were no children of Death Eaters on the list." The second year met his eye with a challenging stare, and Draco wondered what strength serum this child had taken to have the bollocks to say that to him. Blaise nodded his agreement to come to the carriage as a dismissal to her, and she left. It was going to be a long year. Draco stewed while Blaise was gone. The whole business with Umbridge and the Inquisitorial Squad had put him on the wrong side of the fight for a lot of people, students and teachers alike. Last year, culminating with his father's capture at the Ministry, was piling on bad after worse. And if Voldemort had his way, Draco would be public enemy number 1 as soon as Dumbledore's wand hit the ground. He would never be welcomed back to this school, much less the rest of Free Wizarding Society, Draco was certain. He has to accept that, but how would Hermione handle that? Should she even have to? Oh. Blaise returned some time later, fighting his way into the door as it stuck on something briefly in the track. Draco thought his mind was playing tricks on him. What with the lack of sleep these past few weeks, it looked like a bit of white. Like a tissue or handkerchief, but then it was gone. They discussed the group that had attended old Sluggy's dine-in, and Blaise reiterated what the young Ravenclaw had said. "I don't think Slughorn's interested in Death Eaters." Well, who cares what he's interested in? What is he, when you come down to it? Just some stupid teacher. Draco feigned boredness. "I mean, I might not even be at Hogwarts next year. What's it matter to me if some fat old husband likes me or not?" "What do you mean, you might not be at Hogwarts next year?" said Pansy angrily. He and Blaise exchanged a look. Blaise knew Pansy still hoped for a betrothal contract at graduation. "Well, you never know. I might have moved on to bigger and better things." "Do you mean him?" Pansy asked quietly. He shrugged. He was not eager to say anything about his mark or the job with which he was tasked, but the secrecy enchantments prevented him from doing so. Anyway. But during the ride, he'd come to one certain conclusion. If the task went as planned, he was not going to be able to come back for 7th year. Better to put the idea of his leaving Hogwarts out there first to make it seem like his idea. "Mother wants me to complete my education, but personally, I don't see it as that important these days. I mean, think about it, when the Dark Lord takes over, is he going to care how many OWLS or NEWTS anyone's got? Of course he isn't. It'll be all about the kind of service he received, the level of devotion he was shown." "And you think you'll be able to do something for him?" asked Blaise. 16 years old and not even fully qualified yet. Their eyes met, and Draco could sense the real question in Blaze's eyes. It didn't matter how qualified he was, he would never believe in the Dark Lord's ideas, so how could he carry out his plans? I've just said, haven't I? Maybe he doesn't care if I'm qualified. Maybe the job he wants me to do isn't something that you need to be qualified for. Draco fought to maintain a steady timbre in his voice. Blaze sucked in a breath, and Theo gave him a hard stare, as if to say, we'll talk about this again. The group gathered their trunks, and as Greg pulled his down, Draco heard an odd grunting noise and a rustle of fabric from overhead. It reminded him vaguely of something. The train slowly ground to a stop and the group left, Pansy dawdling as though she hoped to catch a private Thistral carriage with him. You go on, I just want to check something, he told her, chivvying her after bacon and eggs. He pulled the blind shut on the compartment door window, looking sidelong out of his eye at the luggage rack. It was empty except there. In the corner, a bit of black fabric poked out. It was no more than an inch square, but it floated, hovering inches above the smooth silver metal of the rack. Someone was under an invisibility cloak. And there was only one wizard he knew on this train that owned one. Petrificus Totalis. Potter fell from the luggage rack, curled in upon himself like a ridiculous turtle. I thought so. I heard Goyle's trunk hit you. And I thought I saw something white flash through the air after Zabini came back. Draco looked down at Potter's muggled trainers. With sudden realization, Draco knew that Potter had heard every word he'd said, and would go back to Hermione and the Weasel with that knowledge, speculating about what job Draco might have been asked to do. All his denials, his comforting words to Hermione this summer would be for naught. Though when it came down to it, truthfully, did he expect to be able to keep Hermione in his life this year? After what he'd pledged to do, after what he'd allowed to be branded upon his arm? As soon as they were face to face, she'd know he was keeping secrets, and none of them were good. Perhaps if he embarrassed Potter here and now, created a bigger enemy of him than even before, she would get the message. He was wrong for her. Damaged goods. Do not touch. Dangerous. But did he actually want that? His brain asked. Of course not, answered his heart. You didn't hear anything I care about, Potter, but while I've got you here. He raised his boot and stamped on Harry's face. Not enough to do more than bust his nose, but enough to make it hurt. Blood spurted everywhere and Draco fought back bile. That's from my father. Potter still thought his anger stemmed from the way Lucius had been sent away to Azkaban, and that was for the best. If the wizard found out about him and Hermione, or his task regarding Dumbledore, it would be really bad. Let him assume this was just for revenge's sake. Now, let's see. Draco pulled the invisibility cloak out from under Potter, the lovely cloak that he'd kissed the most beautiful witch under, and tossed it over the prone wizard's body. I don't reckon they'll find you till the train's back in London, he said quietly, thinking that he would gladly trade places with Potter right now if Hermione would only come with him. See you around, Potter, or not. Oh. He exited his compartment, dragging his trunk behind him. On the platform, a witch slightly older than him with mousy brown hair asked him, Watcher, are you the last off? He met her eyes that looked familiar even in this stranger's face. He stared at her for a moment and lost his breath when she leaned into him to whisper, Watcher, Draco. He didn't know who she was, but he recognized a friend, someone who knew him, the real him. No. There's one more. Check in compartment 14. Cheers, then. And chin up, Drake. You're safe here. He looked back up to her eyes that looked for a brief moment like his mother's, so much that he considered Paul a juice. They crinkled in a smile, and he found himself smiling back, in spite of the lie she told him. He wasn't safe here. None of them were. And it was because of him. Oh. What took you so long, Draco? We were worried. Pansy batted her lashes at him from her seat to his left at the Slytherin table. Ran into Potter getting off the train. Let's just say he's going to be even later than me. Several Slytherins nearby laughed uproariously, asking for more details. By the time the story was through, he'd fiercely battled Potter to the brink of certain death and had emerged victorious, sending Potter back to London a tall tale that was immediately dispelled when the scar-faced wizard himself strolled in wearing muggle clothes. Dried blood all over his jumper. Potter stared daggers at him, and Draco continued to laugh to himself to avoid the sickened feeling inside. If Potter only knew what was to come, he would have gladly stayed on that train until London, and then boarded another one and kept going. At least, that's what Draco felt like doing right now. Hermione's copper eyes were watching him now, and he realized he was still sneering in Potter's direction. His incredulous and annoyed expression dropped, and he turned his eyes to her, regretful silver meeting the anguished copper. She broke off her gaze and turned to the teacher's table at the head of the hall. Dumbledore was standing at the podium. He held up his hands for silence, and Draco noticed that he had an injured hand, the skin blackened and revolting. Based on the whispers, lots of students found it to be an odd injury. Most burns could be healed in minutes by a halfway competent healer. Dumbledore shook his sleeve over his hand with a small smile, as if to say, "Nothing to see here." The new professor was introduced, and Draco was surprised to learn that he would be teaching potions. It was even more surprising to hear that Snape would head defense against the dark arts. Draco knew that Snape had wanted the job for years and had been denied it, for which he'd personally been thankful, potions being his favorite subject. Plus, the defense against the dark arts job appeared to be, frankly, cursed. Why the change? He met Snape's steady gaze, which of course revealed nothing. He apparently wasn't the only one questioning this. The room had erupted in a low hubbub of noise, whispered questions, and even a handful of "what the fucks?" The most vehement outburst, however, came from the recently nasal-crushed wizard at the Gryffindor table. Potter looked not just angry, but downright distressed. Draco wasn't too surprised. For as much as Draco considered potions to be his own pet subject, Potter likely considered defense against the dark arts to be his, especially taking into account the defense club that he and Hermione ran the year before. Having his favorite subject overtaken by his least favorite teacher was going to be frustrating for Potter, and likely hilarious for everyone else. Dumbledore continued with his school announcements as though nothing was amiss. Now, as everybody in this hall knows, Lord Voldemort and his followers are once more at large and gaining in strength. Silence fell like a bucket of cold water over the crowd. Every student stopped mid-sentence, turning to look at Dumbledore's brazenness. The headmaster continued to speak, but Draco could no longer process the words. He just looked openly at the man in front of him, the wizard with his half-moon glasses and long white beard, who had been a steadfast, strong, and stalwart presence at the school for all of Draco's years there as well as the years before then. And it was up to him, a 16-year-old armed with nothing but a likely infected brand and a magic wand, to take down a wizard with more power in his black and pinky finger than Draco had the temerity to hear for, even imagine. "I trust you to conduct yourselves, always, with the utmost regard for your own and others' safety," Dumbledore finished. And what did that mean, exactly? If he was to conduct himself with regard for his own safety and the safety of others, Hermione, his mother, his friends, there could be no question as to what he had to do. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Besides that, Draco knew that if he didn't do the task, someone else would be chosen to carry it out. Vince, Greg, Pansy, or one of the 5th or 7th year students who had a relative amongst the Death Eaters. It mattered little that he did not want to do it. In times of war, sacrifices were chosen, undesirable decisions were made for the greater good. This would be his second one. Subconsciously, his right hand cradled his tender left forearm, his first undesirable decision. The students were filing out of the great hall now, and Draco stood to join them. Out of habit, he searched the crowd for her cloud of curls, but she must have gone ahead, needing to get a head start on all those staircases. His handkerchief warmed in his pocket. "Meet me behind the Caldwell statue." 30 minutes. For the first time ever, he considered not meeting her. But he knew that he wouldn't be able to resist. The pull to be near her calming influence, even if she was angry with him, was too great. He waited until the crowds had dissipated, then stopped at Hagrid's side. "Malfoy," the tall wizard said in greeting. "Hagrid," he replied. "Busy summer. How is your brother?" "Comin' along right fine, thank you for askin'. How was your summer?" "Not very good." Draco struggled to keep his voice from cracking from the sudden rush of emotion. Hagrid had been the first person to ask him that question, as his friends had avoided the question, knowing the answer wasn't good. I imagine it wasn't." Hagrid sensed that the topic was best left there and changed the subject. "Lookin' forward to care of magical creatures." "Yes. Got a dragon for us this year? Or a chupacabra? Or did you crossbreed those to make a blood-sucking, fire-breathing flying monster for us to raise? Hagrid pretended to consider it. Not the worst idea ye have come up with, Malfoy. Definitely not the worst, he smirked. He raised a hand in a small gesture of goodbye to the professor, making his way towards the dungeon entrance. Professor Snape was waiting for him by the stairs leading down into the dungeons. Hello, Professor. Congratulations. I know you've wanted the defense job for a long time. Yes, Mr. Malfoy. And I understand that you took on a new role this year as well. Snape pierced him with a calculating look from his narrowed black eyes. Draco stilled. He was curious to know if word of his new allegiance had reached anyone outside of the handful of Death Eaters that had been in the room. He wondered briefly if his father knew, and what Lucius had thought about it. Draco was surprised to find that the secrecy bond apparently did not apply to Snape. He guessed that it was because Snape had already been told. But why did the Dark Lord trust him? Whose side was Snape on anyway? He seemed to help Dumbledore and the Order, yet he knew this. Draco decided to play dumb. Not sure what you mean, Professor. Quidditch Captain. I trust you got your badge by Owl Post, along with your letter. Draco dimly remembered the pin falling onto his bed covers as he opened the letter. Yes, I appreciate the vote of confidence, Professor. But I'm not sure I have what it takes this year to lead. Perhaps one of my teammates. The only carryovers from last year's team are yourself, Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle. While I admire the beaters for their proficiency at swinging bats, I'm afraid neither of them are ready for a role of leadership such as this. Snape cocked an eyebrow at him knowingly. It is unlike you to turn down a position of such great authority, Mr. Malfoy. Are you certain that everything is all right? No, Professor, he said, then caught himself. That is to say, no, I feel like with my studies and my prefect duties this year, it may be too much to handle to take on yet another leadership role. Perhaps it's time for some of the new blood to take over. I remember Gr8t doing quite well in Chaser tryouts last year. He only just got beat out by Pusey. And that probably had more to do with Pusey's friendship with Montague than it did with his skill. Perhaps Gr8t would be a better choice. Gr8t was a burly fifth-year student who looked as though he had been shaving since he was 7. He had a beater's build, but had the lithe quickness of a chaser. Are you certain, Draco? He was surprised to see what looked like concern in Snape's eyes. Yes. Besides, after what happened with last year's captain, perhaps the role is cursed. He looked pointedly at Snape, raising his own eyebrow. Snape gave him a grim smile. Perhaps you're right. Well, I know it has been a long summer and you are eager to spend a bit of time with your classmates that you haven't seen all summer. Please don't forget about curfew, however. They parted, and Draco got the sense that the older wizard knew that he would be leaving the dungeons for a bit of time tonight. Oh. Draco headed to the dungeons and entered the Slytherin common room, greeting a handful of people to whom he hadn't yet spoken. He unpacked his trunk quickly in his dormitory, popped a spearmint lozenge in his mouth, and made his way back upstairs through the labyrinthine maze of staircases to find Caldwell the Cantankerous. In spite of his fears and worries that she'd chew his face off about Potter's nose, Pansy's over-fondness on the train, and the secrets he was keeping, and in spite of his unwillingness to involve her in any of the shit he was about to embark upon this year, there was a spring in his step and a smile on his face as he climbed the ungodly number of stairs. He was going to see his girl.